Okay, I think we're going. Hello and welcome to episode 95 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and I will probably continue to be your host for quite a while, unless people run out of questions, or if out of considerations for progressivism and diversity and inclusion and all that, I may just be suddenly replaced by an obese black lesbian who may or may not know anything about Buddhist philosophy. But until that time happens, I'm going to be answering questions, and we got some relatively interesting questions. Not that we don't pretty much always get at least a few juicy, meaty kind of questions, but we got some good ones this time. Maybe slightly better than average, just a little bit. Just statistically speaking. So anyways, I'm going to commence to answering questions here. And the first question is from GameFap. And GameFap says, where can I get that Bigfoot canvas you have in the background? Which is right there. And the thing is, it's not really a canvas. That is glazed porcelain. It's like a big tile thing that has been framed. And it's an original artwork by an artist named Terry Stolz. And I guess you could he does have a website, so it'd be terrystolzartwork.com, and it's TERRYSTOLZ artwork.com. But considering that it's like possibly he made only one of them, there may not be anything resembling it that he has for sale right now. So I'm not sure exactly how you're going to get yourself your own personal UFO Bigfoot tile. But when there's a will, there's a way. I'm sure you can come up with something. But that was done by Terry Stolz. So I'm just going to move on to GameFap's next question here, which is a follow-up on the first question, which is, speaking of, what do you think of Bigfoot and cryptids in general? Are there any you think are seriously plausible? And I don't know what seriously plausible would necessarily mean in the case of some kind of paranormal event, because I do think that Bigfoot is a paranormal event. That some materialistic atheist types who nevertheless are open-minded with regard to Bigfoot would consider Bigfoot or Sasquatch or Yetis or whatever to be just a species of animal, maybe some kind of offshoot of the hominid line or something. But I do consider Bigfoot to be a kind of paranormal event, like a sighting of Bigfoot, assuming that it's not just, a bear or something that people misidentify. So it's just like pretty much any other kind of paranormal event, just going with the theory of George P. Hansen in his great book, The Trickster and the Paranormal, that we have a certain amount of structure. You got so-called laws of physics and so forth, but that's not enough. We also have to have sort of like a sociological, psychological structure that keeps everything more or less predictable and more or less safe. And nevertheless, there's always going to be a certain amount of chaos that is able to seep through into our world through the cracks between the rules, between the laws and so forth. And Bigfoot would be something along those lines. I think there's a good chance that like UFOs and grays and that sort of thing are also more paranormal than some alien species flying through space in nuts and bolts spacecraft to come to this planet. So cryptids in general, I'm abnormally open-minded with regard to the possibility of anything. I am a little bit skeptical of like a plesiosaur in Loch Ness or maybe a family of plesiosaurs. I guess it would have to be like a breeding population of plesiosaurs in Loch Ness, which seems pretty unlikely to me. But Bigfoot, I mean, there's a legend of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, or something along the lines of Sasquatch, all around the world. Sort of like ghosts and so forth. And that's kind of setting me up for the next question, which is also, it's coincidentally about Bigfoot or Sasquatch. So, getting back to GameFap's question here, though. What do I think of Bigfoot and cryptids in general? I think that they are, for the most part, paranormal. Somebody finds a Tasmanian tiger, Tasmanian wolf, the thylacine, if you will. That's sort of like a cryptid. It's considered to be extinct, but people keep claiming to see them and see their footprints and so forth. That could just be like just a standard scientific biological explanation. But something like Bigfoot or leprechauns, elves, greys, little people that kind of mess with people sometimes, mess with big people, I mean. I think that it's more this sort of like a world kind of similar to ours that kind of bleeds through into this version of reality, and some people who are more liminal or have they're just more receptive to strange things, I guess, more liminal, that they're more likely to experience these kind of things. So yeah, I'm fairly open-minded on that with regard to that sort of thing, like ghosts also, for example. From the Buddhist point of view, I think Bigfoot would be just categorized as some kind of monster that belongs to the realm of the four great kings, which would actually be a superhuman level, although it's just kind of a catch-all level for all sorts of terrestrial monster-like beings. So with regard to any of them being seriously plausible, I think most of them, well, maybe I shouldn't say most of them, but lots of them are plausible in the sense of just being a kind of paranormal event that to some degree might be conjured up, like materialized by sort of like a Jungian, like collective unconscious or something that works in symbols, and certain symbols are common to the human race and can just result in people seeing these things and maybe even being abducted by these things sometimes. But the Loch Ness Monster, I am fairly skeptical of. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Jeffrey. And Jeffrey says, have you ever encountered a Sasquatch? What is the Burmese lore of them? And that's two questions, so I'm going to have to separate this. Okay, have I ever encountered a Sasquatch? The answer is no. So that's an easy one. That's one word there, or it would have been one word if I hadn't kept talking. So no, I have never seen a Sasquatch. My father, when I was a kid, claimed that he had a friend who saw a Sasquatch, and he was driving home on a very rainy night. The friend was, according to what my father told me, and a Sasquatch crossed the road. It was a country road, and it was white, like an albino Sasquatch or an abominable snowman or something, and it had an injured leg, so it was kind of limping and dragging one leg in the pouring down rain. But that's the closest I've ever come to encountering a Sasquatch. Is I encountered my father, who encountered some friend of his who allegedly encountered a Sasquatch. But getting to Jeffrey's, I almost call him Effrey right now. I don't know why I left the J off. I didn't do it on purpose, Jeffrey. Nothing personal here. But Jeffrey's second question here was, what is the Burmese lore of them? And there are beings that are allegedly existent in Burma that come fairly close, like remarkably close to the standard description of a Sasquatch. And that is a being called a Thiye, as in the Burmese exclamation, Ant Pwe Thiye, which means, well, Ant Pwe is like, it's like a festival of alarm, and Thiye is this being. And they're big and they're hairy, and they live in the forests, and they smell bad, and they mess with people sometimes so that they're scary, which could also apply to Sasquatches and Bigfoot and so forth. But the Burmese consider the Thiye to be a kind of ghost. It's kind of a spirit being that can appear and disappear, which would explain why nobody has ever caught a Sasquatch, at least uncontroversially. In some tabloids or something, you might have some that have been caught and put on display or whatever, but not uncontroversially. It just has not been examined by scientists and documented and given a scientific name and so forth. So, yeah, that's the Burmese lore of them. I really don't know a whole lot about the Burmese Thiye. I've never encountered one of those either, although I did live in a forest that was supposedly infested with them. And people were afraid to go through that forest at night because it was infested by Thiye. And I lived in that forest for years and never came across one. So it could be that because I was a monk, they steered clear of me. They steered clear of me. They just kind of avoided me. But yeah, I'm not very prone to witnessing paranormal events, not nearly so much as certain other people, including my father. So I guess I've exhausted myself in describing the Burmese Thiye, but there is a kind of Sasquatch-like being that lives in Burma, and the only real difference between the American Sasquatch and the Thiye is that the Thiye is just considered to be a paranormal, like a ghost type creature. I don't know if you even call it paranormal, because ghosts are just considered to be natural existent beings. They're just at a different level of reality than us, or different subtlety of matter. Whereas the Sasquatch is considered to be a kind of flesh and blood living creature that is either some kind of, wild animal or wild kind of semi-human, or possibly in some cases even a kind of alien. For example, there's a large correlation between Sasquatch sightings and UFO encounters. And that some people have actually claimed to see Bigfoot on UFOs, like when they get it abducted and taken into the UFO to have people, or to have grays like probing them and so forth. Sometimes they'll see a Sasquatch there, which could just be a Wookiee for all I know. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Siovach and Sipad Zidana. And Siovach and Sipad Zidana says, in a much older Q&A, you mentioned that there are suttas where regular arahants are called Buddhas as well, along with anagamis referring to arahants. Can you please cite those? I think it supports the idea of the Buddha originally being called the Tathagata, and was the unique name he was called by his followers during his own life. Well, there are a few suttas where a regular enlightened being, an arahant, is called a Buddha, which does make sense because Buddha simply means enlightened or awakened. So any arahant would be enlightened or awakened, just as the Buddha was an arahant. The Buddha is called an arahant. It's like Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhasa. So I think originally Buddha and arahant were pretty much synonymous. Although Gautama Buddha was called the Buddha, partly because he was the leader of the Buddhist movement at the time, I guess. With regard to the state of non-return apparently being used as a synonym for enlightenment, that would be the first several suttas of the Idivuddhaka, possibly found elsewhere, but those are the ones that I'm aware of. And with regard to arahants being called Buddhas, I know it's in the Tipitaka somewhere. I know it's in the suttas. I just do not recall the exact suttas where an ordinary enlightened being is called Buddha. But getting to this statement at the end, that's kind of a little appendix to the question, where Siovak and Sipad Zidana is saying, I think it supports the idea of the Buddha originally being called the Tathagata and was the unique name he was called by his followers during his own life. I think it's possible that, I think there is one or two epithets that the Buddha is called that might be even more common than the Tathagata, like Sugata. Sometimes some old translations called the wellfarer, he who is well gone. Or I think sometimes it's just called like the happy one or the fortunate one or something. And also, of course, he was called Bhagawa by a lot of people. So, the Tathagata, I'm not sure. The Tathagata also may have originally been, like, it could have applied to any fully enlightened being. And I really do not think that there was, at the philosophical level, any difference between the Buddha and any enlightened being. I think he was just teaching people, look, I did it, you can do it too. And it was later glorification of the founder of the system that resulted in this, like, orders of magnitude between fully enlightened Buddha and an ordinary arahant, even though they had the exact same amount of wisdom, at least going with Abhidhamma, because in Abhidhamma, absence of delusion is the same as wisdom. Amoha equals panya. So any enlightened being would have zero delusion, which means they would have the same amount of wisdom as any other fully enlightened being. The Buddha is probably more of an original thinker and maybe presumably more intelligent, just like intellect-wise, which could very much help him to devise the system when others had not. But with regard to just transcendent wisdom, he would be the equal of his most lowly, fully enlightened disciple. So, but yeah, what he was called during his own lifetime, is just Buddha, Bhagawa, maybe Tathagata, maybe Sugata, and probably a few others, possibly some that have just been lost that we don't even know. Just the Samana Gautama. I'm sure a lot of people were just calling him, the philosopher Gautama during his lifetime. So I think I'll just move on to Siovak and Sipad Zidana's next question here, which is how to overcome laziness, sloth, and torpor, etc. Any practical advice from text or experience would be appreciated. There's at least one sutta that deals specifically with overcoming sloth and torpor, and I don't recall which sutta it is. I'm relatively lazy and don't like to do homework for answering these, like read the questions in advance and then like look up the answers. If I can do that, pretty much anybody can do it. But so there is at least one sutta, probably more than one, talking about how to overcome sloth and torpor. There's probably some discussion of that in Vinaya also, the rules of monastic discipline. But I do recall there is a sutta or a scene in Vinaya where the Buddha is giving advice about what to do when you're like sleepy. And I think some of it is just like pulling on your earlobes and like splashing cold water on your face, or imagining bright light, like meditating on like a light casino or something. An obvious one that I would resort to a lot of the time is just getting up and doing walking meditation. If you're just starting to doze by just sitting there sedentary and inactive, then obviously it's much harder to fall asleep when you're actually, up and moving around. So doing walking meditation is a good thing to do when you're meditating. There was one kind of it was like a drastic last resort when I was doing really intensive practice in a cave. I shouldn't even be saying this, but I'm saying it anyway, just because that's the way I am, where I would actually stimulate a certain part of my body just to the point where it was stimulated and then stop, because that would cause a certain amount of mental arousal, increased heart rate, and so forth, which actually worked pretty well. Although some people just don't know when to stop. That's the problem. So, yeah, I guess, I mean, I'm sure I'm forgetting some of the bits of advice, but I remember, like, at the very end, is the Buddha is saying that when you've tried everything and you're still sleepy, then apparently your body needs some sleep, and then you better lie down and go to sleep. Of course, being mindful of the moment of waking. You're just sleeping as long as is necessary to rest your body so that you can continue practicing. So, I think I've been talking mainly about sleepiness, which would be torpor rather than sloth. And Sasquatch and Sipat apparently is lazy also, although they're similar. And so, it's like laziness and sleepiness. Sloth and torpor are two words that are not common in the English language anymore, at least not in America. So laziness and sleepiness would probably be better translation of Tina Mida, which is the original Pali. Tina is like laziness, and Mida is sleepiness. So, how else to overcome laziness? I mean, just brute force of willpower, I guess. But again, it's if you're up and active, doing walking meditation instead of sitting meditation, that helps. But being lazy in general can actually be advantageous to a meditator, because you can just sit there and do nothing essentially and be meditating properly and be lazy at the same time. It's a win-win scenario in that respect. So I guess I'm going to move on to Sasquatch and Sipat third question, which is as follows. Can you please do an analysis of Ajahn Sona's short essay on breath meditation practice in Theravada tradition? He tracks its evolution from the Patisambhita Magga to the Vimutti Magga to the Visuddhi Magga. And I mean, it's not that short of an essay, because I made it about halfway through and I just kept scrolling down, and it's not that short of an essay. And so this is sort of like a variation. This kind of question is like a variation on the kind of question that I was remarking upon. I think it was the previous Q&A, where somebody will submit a kind of essay and at the bottom say thoughts. So this is sort of a similar one, where instead of writing the essay themselves, they just send a link to somebody else's essay or to a video, which might be relatively long. Anything more than 8 minutes is a long video for me. And then like thoughts. So anyways, I made it halfway through, and Ajahn Sona was talking about how, I mean, at least the first half of the essay is talking about misinterpretation by the commentarial tradition on the idea of the nimitta, which is considered to be a hallmark of access concentration, which means you're right at the threshold of first jhana. And there's really no explanation of this in the suttas. It's like a later commentarial thing. And the three texts that are referred to here, the Patisambhita Magga, the Vimutti Magga, and the Visuddhi Magga, are all commentarial works. The Patisambhita Magga was an old enough commentary that it actually got included into the Tipitaka, but it's pretty obviously from a later stratum, a much later stratum than the earliest suttas. So maybe it was added like around the time of the Third Council or something. So, I mean, it's sort of, the Buddha is talking figuratively about, like the sign of meditation. And then by the time you get to Buddhaghosa and the Visuddhi Magga, they're interpreting it literally, that you really do have to see this sign. That, I mean, it's from the commentarial tradition. It's really not canonical. the whole idea of access concentration being the threshold into first jhana is not canonical. And I mean, I would even take it further and just saying the whole interpretation of jhana, especially first jhana, as a superhuman mental state. I just consider that to be a misinterpretation, a garbling of what the Buddha taught. So I really don't have any problem with Ajahn Sona saying that, like some description of a meditative state got misinterpreted by scholar monks who probably didn't meditate all that much, which is kind of ironic considering that the Visuddhimagga is one of the most important meditation manuals in Theravada Buddhism. But when I was a monk and reading the Visuddhimagga, it seemed more of a manual on self-hypnosis than on actual cultivation of samadhi. But of course, that is unorthodox. So, yeah, based on the first half of the article that I read, I don't have any problem with Ajahn Sona saying that over the centuries, the commentarial tradition started misunderstanding certain aspects of meditation because, as a general rule, the monks who write books tend not to be the monks who are doing the intensive practice. But even the Patisambhidamagga, which is the only text that is canonical, even that is relatively late text. And the Vimuttimagga just got phased out. I mean, the Visuddhimagga was based on an earlier commentarial work called the Vimuttimagga, which I think exists only in like Chinese translation, which then got translated into English. Then again, I think like several years ago, I think I remember hearing some mention of an actual Pali version of the Vimuttimagga was found in some old monastery in Sri Lanka or something. So, yeah, I really don't have a whole lot to say about the half of the article by Venerable Ajahn Sona that I read, other than it seemed to make sense to me. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Austin. And Austin says, Goenka claimed the only way to make thorough progress in vipassana is through meditation of sensations on the body, because awareness of sensations on the body links the conscious mind to the unconscious mind. Did Lord Buddha ever teach this? And I'm pretty sure the answer to that would be no. First of all, Theravada Buddhism, as far as I know, has no concept of an unconscious or subconscious mind other than this weird state called the bhavanga citta, which is described in the Abhidhamma texts, which is just a kind of test pattern. Like those of you who are old enough to remember may recall that it used to be on TV, like when the network was off the air, there would just be this test pattern which had these weird things like crosshairs, and there was a picture of like an American Indian and a few other things. And it's kind of that's the way bhavanga citta would work. It's like your last conscious perception before you die is your test pattern bhavanga citta throughout your subsequent life, like your next existence. Your last perception before you died in the previous life is like your subconscious test pattern. Like whenever you're like sound asleep or you're just not thinking anything in particular for a split second, it's this test pattern that takes over, this bhavanga citta. So yeah, the whole idea of an unconscious mind, it's kind of, it seems slightly scandalous to me that experts on the human mind, like a lot of Buddhist monks, they never really had the insight to realize that most of our mentality is below the surface. I'm sure, Abhidhamma kind of takes for granted that all sorts of things are happening in your mind that you're not aware of, but it's all linear and at the same level. It's just happening so fast, for example, that you can't catch all of it with your conscious thinking mind. You don't have enough time to advert to something and like seriously perceive it enough that it really registers very well. But the whole idea of like deceiving oneself, people operating at different levels of consciousness simultaneously, like hysteria and so forth. There's really not much explanation of that um, until you get up into relatively modern times. I mean, Freud was the first person that really tried to systematize it in a scientific manner. Author like Dostoevsky, who was before Freud, had very good insights into that sort of thing just from observing human nature. But for some reason, um, Orthodox Theravada Buddhism just doesn't really have a concept of the unconscious mind that is actually functioning and influencing our behavior. I mean, other than maybe karma. I mean, karma would be a kind of subconscious momentum, but the Orthodox, like the commentarial tradition, really doesn't interpret it that way. So, I mean, there's lots of evidence for a subconscious mind, and even certain Buddhist concepts like anusia or latent tendencies and karma and so forth would seem to imply a subconscious mind, but still, Orthodox Theravada really does not have much of a concept of a subconscious mind, like the mind working at different levels simultaneously. According to Abhidhamma, you can't even like think and walk at the same time, because there has to be like this. Your mind is continually like alternating between all these things because it can't like it's incapable of parallel processing. It has to be completely linear, like a one-dimensional. So there is that, but also Goenka claiming that the only way to make thorough progress in vipassana is through meditation of sensations on the body. Well, I mean, if you read the Satipatthana Sutta, there are 4 Satipatthanas. One of them is Vedananupasana, which would be like contemplation of feelings. Another one's Kayanupasana, which is contemplation of the body. And that one is kind of problematic to me because I don't see how you could contemplate your body except through the medium of mental states or feelings or so forth, which would be mental. So I don't think the Buddha would have taught 4 Satipatthanas if only one of them was really effective. So, yeah, the Goenka people have a lot of kind of strange ideas, and they consider Goenka to be a kind of infallible oracle, which I do not think he was. So, I guess I answered that question. I'm going to move on to Austin's next question here, which is, when I develop strong samadhi on the in and out breath, do I need to shift my concentration to develop sati or awareness in other areas besides the breath? Well, I mean, so long as you're still making progress, so long as you're still meditating well, you may as well continue with the breath, because mindfulness of breathing can take you, according to Orthodox tradition, all the way to 4th jhana. It can take you all the way to the top. So it's not necessary to shift your concentration to develop awareness, to shift it away from meditation on the breath, if meditation on the breath is the main kind of meditation you've been practicing. I think the only real reason for shifting to a different kind of meditation would be if it's just not working anymore. If you're not making progress, or it's stagnating, or you're just getting bored with it so that your mind's just wandering off again and again, then you might be justified in switching to a different method. I mean, just go with what works. But if meditation on the breathing, anapanasati, is still working, then there's no real need to switch to something else. That could be another Goenka thing where they're saying, you start with the breath and then you move to the feelings of various parts of your body, the body scan stuff. That, I assume, would be where Austin got this question, maybe, because he mentions Goenka in the previous question. But yeah, it's not really orthodox. There are numerous factors about Goenka that are not particularly orthodox. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with not being particularly orthodox, because I'm not particularly orthodox either. But just like oversimplifying Dhamma into like, I'm not even sure how to explain this, because ultimately Dhamma is extremely simple. If you follow the teachings of the Atthakavagga, I mean, how complicated is it if you don't have any beliefs, or you're not adhering to any thoughts or anything? I mean, it's like super duper mysticism, really, which is very simple, no moving parts. But I mean, if you're taking Orthodox tradition and then just streamlining the heck out of it and still insisting that that is Orthodox, that's a whole different kettle of wax, so to speak. So yeah, I mean, the short answer here is, if it's still working, there's no need to shift to a different kind of meditation. And you'll get, just going with Orthodox tradition again, you will get deeper meditation through mindfulness of breathing than you will from, for example, doing the body scans of the sensation in different parts of your body, which includes more busy work. It's more complicated, and so it's not going to go as deep. So I'm just going to move on to Austin's next question here, which is, can you explain your meditation technique again? You shift concentration between the touch of the thumbs to the nose and then the ears, ? Well, this is referring to a system that I worked out when I was doing intensive practice in a certain cave in northwestern Burma. And I was really going for it. And my mind is too changeable that the same meditation technique isn't going to work all the time. Sometimes my mind is more like restless, and so I have to have more of a restless kind of meditation with lots of busy work to keep the mind occupied. Other times my mind is really quiet and subtle, and so I use a more quiet and subtle meditation. So I came up with what I called 4 gears, like a car. First gear, that was like desperation mode. That's when like my mind just does not want to settle down at all. So first gear would be the primary object of meditation would be the sensation of touch between my thumbs. So I'd be sitting in meditation, my thumbs touching like this, and it would just be touching. And it's kind of a good object of meditation because you can adjust the pressure. What am I doing with my thumbs here? You can adjust the pressure. So if it starts getting too subtle, you can push a little harder. You don't want to push too hard, and you can lighten up a little bit. And then that would be the primary object. And then whatever would arise, my mind would start to start going in different directions. Then you just label that and go back to the primary object. And I labeled everything except for breathing, swallowing my slobber, and I think it was hearing. So if those arose, I just kind of be aware of it and then go back to the primary object. But if anything else happened, like I'd start remembering something, you just note remembering, just label it. I mean, I'd be labeling almost everything except, as I say, the breathing process, swallowing my slobber, and hearing. I wouldn't label those just because it would interfere with subsequent gears of meditation. So that was first gear, is just primary object here, and then you just label anything that arises as just keeping the mind just kind of pounding away, beating your mind with a stick, as Sayadaw U Pandita would say. And so then that was like desperation mode. I usually would start off with second gear, which was anapana. And it's just mindfulness of breathing, which would be mindfulness of the sensation of touch of the air at the nostrils. And I wouldn't note it. I wouldn't note breathing and breathing out. I'd just observe that. And then if the mind started to wander again, I would label anything except for, breathing in, breathing out, and slobbering, swallowing my saliva, and hearing. Maybe even once in a while I might even note hearing or label that, but usually I wouldn't. So that was second gear, just anapanasati, with emphasis on the sensation of touch. No breathing in, breathing out. No concept of breathing in, breathing out. No trying to follow your breath in and out, which is not really orthodox. You just are aware of the Vedana, the touch sensation of the air at your nostrils. That would be the primary object. And then again, just note and label anything else that would arise except for those few things that I mentioned. Then third gear. One of the best ways of describing the third gear is like you're in a library and you've got this machine that is broadcasting your thoughts through a loudspeaker. And there's like the big scary librarian with the cat eye glasses that are like on a chain around her big red neck and the beehive hairdo and everything. The stereotypical scary librarian lady who, when you start making noise, she starts like giving you dirty looks. I've been told that libraries are no longer like this anymore, that they're like daycare centers. But I mean, I'm going with like the old fashioned approach, which is pretty much the only approach I know with regard to libraries. So anyways, what you're doing is you're observing your mind carefully and trying to catch any thoughts that arise. And this does have some precedent, at least in the commentarial tradition of Theravada Buddhism, with the story of Potila, who was this monk who was a scholar monk. And the Buddha was continually calling him Tucha Potila, which just means like Potila who is in vain or like good for nothing or empty, useless Potila, pointless Potila. And so finally it kind of embarrassed Potila into thinking, well, maybe I shouldn't be studying so much and not to like actually be practicing Dhamma. So he went off to a monastery out in the forest, a forest monastery, where all the Sangha there was fully enlightened. And he goes to the abbot and says, please teach me. And they're saying, oh, you're too renowned of a scholar. It's like, you're our senior and I don't want to teach you. So he'd go to the second in seniority and he didn't want to teach him. And then the third in seniority, he didn't want to teach him until finally he gets to like a 9-year-old novice who became enlightened before he was even ordained, really. It's a kind of stereotypical enlightened novice that you'll find in the text sometimes, where as soon as the razor touches their head to shave them, to get them ready to become a novice monk, they become enlightened. They're just so ripe for it. So anyways, the novice, the novice accepts. He says, but first, I'm going to have to test you. I want you to just walk out into that lake, or it was like a pond or a lake there. And so Potila just takes off out into the lake, just wades out, gets his robes all wet and everything. So then the novice calls him back and says, all right. You seem to be serious enough. And then he gives him this like a simile of how to meditate. And he says, there's a termite mound with 6 holes. And there's a lizard inside that termite mound. It's hiding. So you want to catch this lizard. So what you do, you cover up 5 of the holes and then you watch very carefully the 6th hole so that when the lizard comes out, you can grab it. And that's essentially third gear, where you're sort of like, you're not paying attention to your 5 senses, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, that you're just watching the mind. That's the sixth hole, the 6th sense base is mind. So you're just watching that carefully. And when the lizard or the unenlightened perception, the thought comes up, you catch it. When you just note it, and then it just fades out again. So you'll notice that if you watch your mind very carefully to see what thought comes up next, sometimes it takes a long time for any thought to come up. So it's sort of like that. It's like just intently observing your own mind, which in and of itself does a really good job of making your mind silent. But still there's this effort involved. It's still perceptual. And so you haven't really got to the highest level yet, which would be 4th gear. And 4th gear is you just kind of relax your mind. You just sit there wide open, just empty and silent. It's like you're wide awake, but your mind is just clear like glass. And again, you may start to think thoughts will just naturally start to arise through the power of kamma, going with Buddhist philosophy. But if you're just wide awake, you just see it, and as soon as you just become aware of it, it just fades out again. But that was like really advanced, and I wasn't able to do that like really well most of the time. So generally, when I was doing my intensive practice, I was mostly between like second and third gear. If second gear wasn't working, I'd try third. Third gear wasn't working, I might go back to second. Sometimes, strangely, like first, second, and third aren't working, but fourth still works just because your mind doesn't want to do all this busy work. It just wants silence and stillness. So, I mean, you got to feel into it. And it is good advice for any meditator to have more than one method, because your mind's not going to be exactly the same all the time. Maybe a few people, there are some people that are just really steady. They don't have particularly expanded moods. They don't have particularly contracted moods. But with me, my mind just expands and contracts, and there's a lot of variability. So it just behoved me to have more than one meditation method, so that when my mind is still, I've got a still meditation method. When my mind is just restless and overactive, I've got a restless, overactive meditation method. Because if you try to do a still meditation method when your mind is overactive, you're just going to derail. I mean, your mind's just going to wander all over the place. But if you try and do like a busy kind of meditation when your mind is tending towards silence, I mean, you're just stuck at the ABCs. You're not going to get very far with it. So that's the long answer to my meditation technique that I mentioned. I assume that's what he's referring to. I have gone with other kinds of meditation techniques, but I won't go into like minute detail because I've got other questions to answer. For example, this one from Rui. And Rui said, "Did you ever experiment with or practice standing meditation?" And yes, I actually did, because there is a monk in Burma, whether he's still alive or not, I don't know, named Tenjidong Seattle. And he specialized in standing meditation. I attended one of his retreats in Burma, in Pagan. And he had like these little booklets. He considered himself to be a kind of medical authority. And I mean, if you read the booklets, you can see that he really was not much of a medical authority. Like, for general health, bitter things are best. But the best bitter things are neem fruits and neem leaves. And for the teeth, white things are best. But the best white thing for your teeth is salt. This kind of stuff. Anyways, he gave a list of benefits of doing standing meditation, and they were all like health benefits. There wasn't any real meditative benefit to doing standing meditation. It's just like you'll never have a stroke in your life, and it improves your circulation, it improves your digestion, this kind of thing. But anyway, I attended this retreat, and we had to do standing meditation sometimes. And he's saying, don't worry if the attendants, if they see you starting to wobble, they'll catch you. But generally, you hear like this thud every now and then from somebody falling over while doing walk or standing meditation. And one of the first things you'll notice about doing standing meditation, if you try to do it, is the soles of your feet get really hot. I mean, it starts to get painful just standing there. A lot of people don't realize that just remaining motionless in any one particular position becomes very uncomfortable after a relatively short period of time. Sometimes it can become painful. Most people just like not being mindful, they'll just shift positions. You're just sitting there on the couch, and it just starts being a little too much pressure or little something that you're starting to feel uncomfortable. They won't even be fully aware of what they're doing. They'll just shift position. So that's kind of a good practice, is just being aware of what your body's doing all the time. Just teach yourself not to fidget, for example. But getting back to standing meditation, yeah, Tenjidong Seattle did not impress me at all. And I wrote a blog post. I don't think it's in any of my books, but if I come up with a fourth book, then it'll probably be in there, because I have enough material for a fourth book which would mainly be describing my personal experiences as a monk, most of it in Burma. And yeah, the Tanjidong retreat that I went to was, it was kind of a fiasco, actually. Partly because, in addition to standing meditation, Tanjidong Seattle also instructed his meditators to breathe a little harder than usual. And the explanation for this does make some sense. It's like, if you breathe a little harder or faster than usual, then you have to use conscious attention to keep doing that, which keeps your mind from wandering away. It kind of sounds plausible, but what people were doing at that retreat is just breathing so hard that they were obviously hyperventilating. And then they just start freaking out or barking like dogs or howling or laughing or crying. It was just like a madhouse going on in that meditation hall. And Tanjidong Seattle, who was not very sophisticated with regard to interpreting certain things, considered that to be piti, which is one of the 7 factors of enlightenment. And if you don't have anything like that, you're not experiencing one of the 7 factors of enlightenment, which is necessary for you to become enlightened. So I actually dropped out of that retreat after a few days. There's actually one of the sponsors of the retreat who was the donor of the monastery, a very rich, very very proud man. And he had a video camera, and anyone started freaking out or acting weird, he'd just run up with this video camera and get footage of it. And one of the reasons why my meditation just didn't work out very well, first of all, I had no desire to hyperventilate. You're just supposed to breathe naturally. And actually, according to the Anapana Sutta, or any kind of instructions in the suttas with regard to breathing meditation, you're supposed to calm the breath, not hyperventilate. And so, as it turns out, my translator was a physiologist. And I'm telling him, these people are hyperventilating. And he's saying, no, that's not possible. It's impossible to hyperventilate because there are natural regulatory systems that prevent us from hyperventilating, which, you wonder why they even have a word for hyperventilate if nobody could possibly hyperventilate. So I actually, just being the uncouth Western barbarian with no sense of propriety, I actually told Tanjidong Seattle that these people are hyperventilating. They're getting drunk on oxygen. It's not PT. They're drunk on too much oxygen in their brain. And he was just grinning. He's like, oh, these barbarians, they have such strange ideas. But it was just too much for me. But getting back to standing meditation, which is what the question is actually about. I didn't really see a whole lot of benefit to it because, first of all, you can fall over and the soles of your feet hurt. And it's really not a stable position for meditating. Like, if you're sitting cross-legged, especially if you're sitting in the full lotus, you've got like a tripod. You're behind and your 2 knees are kind of holding you steady. You're firm like a mountain. But standing meditation is not really steady. And I did not see any real benefit to be had from it that you couldn't get from sitting meditation or walking meditation. You could say it's sort of intermediate between sitting and walking meditations. But I think just alternating between sitting and walking is fine. And since I gave such a long answer to such a short question, I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is from White Ash Piper. And this is kind of an interesting question. Have you seen Secrets of Skinwalker Ranch? The entity they're chasing is totally messing with these scientists. And yeah, it turns out my sweetheart and I have watched the first 3 seasons of Skinwalker Ranch. Although the 4th season, you got to pay money to watch that. And we don't really like the show that much. We don't like it so much that we're willing to pay money to watch it. But there is this ranch called Skinwalker Ranch in northeastern Utah. And the US government spent years studying this because there's all these weird anomalies happening there. Finally, this guy named Brandon, he's some rich guy with his own helicopter. I don't know what he does for a living. He bought the ranch, and then he got this team of scientists and security guys and so forth to continue doing like studying the phenomena there. And one of the main guys is this, he's like a cowboy scientist from Texas. And I just love it when he's talking about, according to Albert Einstein, you just assume that someone who talks with that kind of accent is going to be a hayseed. You know, it's just such it just seems like an anomaly to have like an intelligent person, like a scientist, who talks with this thick Southern accent. I mean, there's no reason why a person can't be intelligent and have a thick Southern accent. Like Bill Clinton, you know, despite his shortcomings and all that, he was a Rhodes Scholar back when universities were still, you know, accepting applicants and giving awards for actual merit and scholastic aptitude and so forth. And he had like an Arkansas accent. So it's just kind of weird to me when the cowboy scientist is talking about Albert Einstein. But yeah, I think that there's something going on there that at the very least there's an anomaly in the magnetic field or something, like House of Mystery. You know, there's lots of places like that where just things happen weird, and then just the expectation of weird things happening helps to like elicit these weird things happening. You know, the faith in the weirdness helps the weirdness to come out. But it does seem like there could be some kind of like a real considerable anomaly, or even like a portal of some sort that's like, I can't remember, it's like 5,000 feet up, it's like a mile up over this place they call the Triangle, and they're continually trying to like launch rockets and fly over it with helicopters and stuff, and there's always this weird stuff happening there. Whether it's a conscious entity there, I don't know. And a lot of the show is just sensationalism. Like, you know, they're trying to drill into this hill and they hit something that the drill won't go through, and there's like metal ore or something in the soil there, and they're saying, oh, it's like this dome-shaped metal object that the drill won't go through, and what's inside this hill? You know, they're like implying that there's like a flying saucer or like an alien base or something in there, when in all likelihood it's just like hard rocks with some metal ore. But I mean, you watch the show, it is pretty obvious that weird things are happening there. Lots of like UFOs and that sort of thing. Cattle mutilations have occurred there. The American Indians had legends of skinwalkers there, which, you know, some sort of paranormal entity. So it's hard to say exactly, and it's you know, it's not going to follow rules. I don't think that scientists are ever going to prove anything other than that there's an increased likelihood of inexplicable stuff going on there. But I do think that there may actually be some kind of weird anomaly or portal or something that's like a mile up in the air up there. But who knows? So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cleefy. And Cleefy says, if everything is interconnected, how Nirvana is connected to Samsara? From my understanding, Nirvana is something separate from Samsara, but then if that is the case, then it contradicts the concept of interconnection of everything. So, here we got a cup. The cup is made out of porcelain. So how is the cup and the porcelain interconnected? I mean, the cup is the form of the porcelain, and the porcelain is the substance or essence of the cup. You take away one, you take away both. You take away the cup, there's no more porcelain. You take away the porcelain, there's no more cup. How are they interconnected? I mean, it's just kind of a weird question, how the cup and the porcelain are interconnected. So, I mean, that's, from my understanding, that's how, like, the absolute, I mean, regardless of what you want to call it Tao, call it capital G God, call it Brahman, call it the Dhammakaya, that would be like the essence. And just the forms of samsara are the form. The underlying essence and the form are like waves in water. That would be another example. I use that analogy quite a lot, actually. I mean, how are waves and water interconnected? Like the waves on the surface of the water and the water itself, how are they interconnected? They just exist at two different levels of reality. Same as the cup. So it's like it's a cup and it's porcelain, both at the same time. But cup doesn't mean porcelain. Porcelain doesn't mean cup. You can have a cup that's made out of something besides porcelain. You can have porcelain that isn't shaped into a cup. They're not synonymous. So they're A and not A at the same time. That this cup just violates the Aristotelian laws of thought because it is A and not A at the same time. But the way you get around that is you just acknowledge that it's at two different levels of truth or two different levels of reality. At that, like the more fundamental level, you've got essence, the essence of water, the essence of porcelain. And then at a more contrived artificial level, you've got form, which is cup or waves or whatever. So you can work out for yourself how they're interconnected, how the porcelain and the cup are interconnected here. How is it interconnected? They're essentially the same, just at two different levels of reality. With regard to Nirvana and Samsara, especially from a Mahayanist point of view, this is just rank heresy from a Theravadan point of view. But Nirvana would be ultimate reality, and Samsara would be based on that. But it would just be like artificial forms that people think are reality, and thus it is like delusional. It's like illusion. But the illusion is based on an underlying reality. So I hope I explained that well enough to confuse everybody, because I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Mr. Special Victory, which in Burmese would be Aung San, who was the father of modern Burma. So anyways, Mr. Special Victory says, do you know anything about the Dhammakaya tradition in Thai Theravada? Wikipedia remarks, quote, the Dhammakaya tradition is known for its teaching that there is a true self connected with nirvana, which was notably criticized in the 1990s as an alleged contradiction of the Buddhist doctrine of anatta, or no self, unquote. Is this true? Well, I really don't know anything about the Dhammakaya tradition in Thai Theravada. I spent like 3 weeks in Thailand as a monk, and those 3 weeks were just spent with Burmese monks in like an empty house that someone had donated for us to stay in while we were in Thailand. We didn't really interact with Thai Buddhists. I mean, I've met monks ordained in Thai traditions. Most Western monks are ordained in a Thai tradition, I'm pretty sure, especially the Ajahn Chah tradition. And I've read about Thai Buddhism. I've talked with Buddhists that were ordained in a Thai tradition, but the Dhammakaya tradition I've really never really heard about. I mean, the Sanskrit version would be the Dharmakaya, which in Mahayana Buddhism is just this pervasive, like infinite formless consciousness or Buddha nature that just pervades the entire universe. So it could be that this Dhammakaya tradition is influenced by Mahayana Buddhism. And I'm pretty sure there was quite a lot of Mahayana Buddhism in Thailand, more so in the past than in the present. But setting aside my ignorance of the Dharmakaya tradition, or Dhammakaya tradition in particular, it is known to me that a lot of very high-profile ajahns who have reputations for being very wise do assert that there is the chitta, or the mind, the consciousness that is like yourself and is also like an aspect of ultimate reality, which might fit into this Dharmakaya or Dhammakaya. Dharmakaya being the Mahayana name for the Dharma body of the Buddha, which pervades the entire universe, which means it's everywhere. And this chitta that certain Thai ajahns assert is, that is the one who knows, that is the one who sees, that is the one who wills, and ultimately it's apparently they're not asserting that there's like an individual soul, like in Christianity, where my soul is different from your soul, that it's all like the same soul, which would be along the lines of like the Upanishadic interpretation, the Hindu interpretation of soul. So, yeah, there are Thai ajahns who do talk about a true self connected with nirvana, the one who knows, the one who sees, that kind of thing. And it may be an influence of Mahayana Buddhism on their thinking, because it certainly is not Orthodox Theravada. So I guess I answered that question. I'm moving on to the next one. This is from 5 Precept Pete. And 5 Precept Pete says, how would you determine the legitimacy of a spirit medium or psychic? And as it turns out, one reason why I kind of like the assemblage of questions in this Q&A is I've got a lot of personal experience with some of these questions, so I'm in a better position to answer them. And it turns out that I had a meeting with a spirit medium or psychic in Burma when I was a relatively junior monk. And it's kind of an interesting story where I had this teacher. He was teaching me Burmese and a few other things, and he was intelligent, but he didn't have a whole lot of common sense. And he and a friend of his took off somewhere, and they were gone for a week. So our English lessons and Burmese lessons, because I was teaching him English at the same time, there was like a hiatus. And then he comes back and he's all excited and agitated. And he says, I want so much to tell you about something, but I know you won't believe me. But he could not restrain himself, so he had to blurt it out that he was talking to a god. And the God was telling him all this stuff. And at first I didn't know what he was talking about. But then, as he blurts out more of the story, it turns out that his friend, who was a monk, had a sister-in-law or something who was a spirit medium or a channeler, as they would be called. Maybe they're even called something different now. But, she's talking about, or this female spirit medium is telling him all this stuff, and she is apparently channeling this deva called Abhaya Kumara, which means like dangerless prince or dangerless boy or something like that. And he said that they had tested her, that she could say what was in closed boxes, what was in closed envelopes, what was behind closed doors, that she could read their minds and so forth. But also she was giving him all this kind of information about his previous lives, under a previous Buddha's dispensation and so forth. That's how he and I met in a previous life. We were both monks under like Kasaba Buddha or something. And a lot of it was stuff that a Burmese person could believe pretty easily. But for a skeptical Westerner, it's like, yeah, that seems kind of far-fetched. So anyways, I got an opportunity to meet with this spirit medium. And just in case that this person really was psychic, like my teacher was saying that she could say what was in closed boxes and behind closed doors and so forth. So I decided to test her. So I prepared a few tests. And one test was a relatively simple one that I got from, I think it was from Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. There's this story of this man whose wife dies, and then he marries another wife, and then he starts being haunted by the ghost of his first wife. So he goes to a Zen monk about it, and the Zen monk says, next time this ghost appears, just reach into a bag of beans, pull out a handful of beans, and then ask this ghost how many beans you've got in your hand, because apparently a ghost will be able to see through the clenched fist and see how many beans are in there. So that's what he does. And when he asks how many beans are in my hand, the ghost just dissolves, disappears. He's not bothered by the ghost anymore, because it was just a manifestation of his own guilty conscience for being unfaithful to his first wife by marrying a second one. So that was easy. Outside my meditation cabin, there were these little fruits. They looked kind of like kumquats. They weren't kumquats. And I think they were inedible to humans. But they were falling out of this tree. They were all over the ground. So I just went out with a little baggie and collected some of these little fruits and set them aside. And then I came up with another test for this spirit medium, which was I made about 24 little squares of cardboard, white cardboard, and I drew a different image on each of these 24 squares. They were fairly simple. There was like a plus sign and a circle and a fish and a candle, just simple things. And then with my eyes firmly closed, and just to be fair, I actually lit some incense and summoned this deity to come and watch me do this before I picked the pictures that I was going to put into the envelope. And then I put them into a can, these little squares, and then I shook it up. And then with my eyes closed, I pulled 3 of them out and put them into an envelope that had like paper already in it, so I wouldn't be able to see through the paper of the envelope. So it was like a padded envelope that I couldn't see into. And then after I closed the envelope, then I opened my eyes, and then I didn't look into the can. I just I covered it up, put it on a shelf. So I had 3 pictures on these little cards in this envelope. I didn't know which 3 they were. I knew the 24 possibilities of what they could be. I didn't know which 3 were in the envelope. So anyways, we go to meet this lady and Abhaya Kumara. And when it came my turn to ask, there's all these people asking questions. Like, somebody sent me something in the mail and I haven't got it yet. Do you know where it is? And this kind of thing. I asked if I could ask a few questions, and then she said yes, or Abhaya Kumara said yes. And the thing is, I wanted to know if she really was psychic or if she was just reading minds. Because if I knew the answer, then if she gave me the correct answer, I still wouldn't know if she was just reading my mind or if she was really had some kind of clairvoyance. Because if she really had clairvoyance, that would be more valuable to me than just reading my mind and telling me what I already believe or whatever. So first I told her that I've got these fruits, and I reached in and held out a handful of fruits. How many fruits do I have in my hand? And then without hesitation, she said, Chok Ku Miao, which means the 6th one. And so everyone says 6. So one at a time, kind of dramatically, I start pulling them out of my hand. It turned out there was like 13 in my hand. And the monk sitting next to me, my teacher, who was just completely sold on the validity and genuineness of Abhaya Kumara, he's like giggling nervously. And there was another monk sitting on the other side who was likewise giggling nervously. Most of the people in the room, probably all of them except me, were just no doubts. This is for real. So she failed the first test, and then the second test was the little cards. And I said, in this envelope are 3 little diagrams, 3 little images on cards. What are they? And again, without hesitation, she said, a flower, a mountain, and a table or chair. And I knew she'd fail the test because none of those were things that I had drawn. So I opened it, and there was a circle, a plus sign, and a candle, a lit candle and a little stand. And so, I really wasn't interested anymore, because she apparently maybe could read minds, but and when it's like a double blind experiment, she couldn't read my mind to find out what the answers were. So she just apparently did not have clairvoyant powers, or maybe it was my own skepticism and doubt that was sort of damping her talent, or Abhaya Kumara's talent. So anyways, I just considered that to be pretty good refutation, and just kind of lost interest. But I was told later by a friend of my teacher that he was still completely 100% on board, that when she said Chao Ku Miao, that means the 6th one. She didn't really say that there were 6 fruits in my hand. This Abhaya Kumara was like a Sakadagami, like a mid-level Buddhist saint too. So, who knows what Abhaya Kumara meant when he said the 6th one. And with regard to the wrong guesses about the flower, the mountain, and the table or chair, well, the circle is shaped kind of like a flower. The mountain, or the plus sign, could represent like a mountain on a map. And the table or chair, well, the candle was probably sitting on the table, just implied to be on a table. So, she was right enough so he could continue believing in it. But yeah, it was sort of East meets West in a case like that. There was a similar time where he was telling me that just a few blocks away from our monastery, a cat had a litter of kittens, and one of those kittens could speak fluent Burmese. And I'm like, that's not possible, Bante. I mean, a kitten doesn't even have like the vocal cords or the speech centers of the brain or anything where it couldn't really speak a human language. And then he's like, well, there's two monks from the building next door, from the dormitory building next door, that are going to go check it out tomorrow. So after they check it out, they'll come back to me, tell me whether it's for real or not, and then I'll let you know. So the next class we had with my teacher, he said, well, they those two monks went there and checked it out, and it's for real. It really does speak fluent Burmese, but it's like you said, it doesn't have the right vocal cords or the speech centers or something, because they couldn't understand anything it was saying. So in all likelihood, it's just the kitten was making weird sounds, maybe because it was sick or just some kind of birth defect or something. It wasn't making the appropriate, correct sounds for a kitten. It just sounded kind of like human speech, maybe. Also, I tried to tell him, it's like in the suttas, it says a monk is not really supposed to consult spirit mediums. That's on the list in the Sila Khanda of the Digha Nikaya. There's this long list of stuff that a good monk doesn't do, and questioning a woman in trance is one of the things that monks aren't supposed to do. It's animal knowledge, tirachana vidya. And so anyways, I point this out to my teacher, and he says, oh, that doesn't really apply here, because Abhaya Kumara is a Sakadagami. He is an Arya. So it's not just an ordinary spirit channeler. It's you're talking to an actual Buddhist saint. So anyways, that's how I would try to determine the legitimacy of a spirit medium, was by doing tests like that, which in this case, the spirit medium in question failed miserably. Although to the people that wanted to believe, it was like water off a duck's back. People are like that. They will just insist on believing something regardless of all evidence to the contrary. And just modern politics, or postmodern politics, is a case in point. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Tig. And Tig says, have you ever chewed on a betel nut? Have you seen Burmese locals chew it? Oh, that's another question, isn't it? Huh. Crypto multiple questions. Okay, so the first question from Tig is, have you ever chewed a betel nut? And yeah, I actually have, because there's a certain city in central Burma called Meitila. And for whatever reason, it is traditional in Meitila, when monks go for alms round, people will hand them betel quids. And a betel quid it's like some sliced betel nut. It's wrapped up in a betel leaf, which is a different plant entirely. The nut comes from a kind of little palm tree, and the leaf comes from, it's related to the pepper family. It grows on a vine. And then they add a few other things. They like lime, not the citrus fruit, but the mineral lime. Not quick lime, I'm pretty sure. And sometimes they'll add a little bit of tobacco. Sometimes they'll add a little bit of a substance called kadichu, which is like the hardened sap of a kind of acacia tree. You know, they'll add certain other ingredients to it. The two main ingredients, or the three main ingredients, are the nut, the leaf, and the lime. You have to have all three. And what the lime does, it causes a chemical reaction with the betel nut and your own slobber, and it turns your slobber into this thick ketchupy goop, this dark red goop. But anyways, I chewed some betel nut because I got some in my bowl when I went for alms in Meitila, and somebody gave me this little packet of betel quids. And so I chewed one just because I was curious. I wanted to see what the effect was. And it had like a mildly stimulant effect, sort of like smoking a cigar or something. You know, it had sort of a similar effect to smoking maybe half a cigar. And I guess the truck drivers chew betel in Burma just as a kind of mild stimulant. So, anyways, that's the first question from Tig. The next one is, have you seen Burmese locals chew it? And yeah, I mean, Burmese guys, especially village guys, they chew betel a lot. And in fact, most of them, or a great many of them, don't brush their teeth either. And so, some Burmese village guys, you got to look really hard to see if they even have teeth, because their mouth is like the top of an old ketchup bottle. It's just like this reddish, blackish crust all over their teeth from chewing betel and not brushing their teeth. And yeah, and then they're spitting this vinegary smelling ketchup spit everywhere. It's relatively disgusting, which kind of helps to explain why mouth kissing is really not a thing in Burma. Traditionally in Burma, men and women do not kiss. In fact, when I was in Burma, it was actually against the law to show a man and a woman kissing on a movie in Burma. So, anyways, after Tig asks, have you seen Burmese locals chew it? He continues here, I've read that the practice tends to result in increased cancer rates in those that combine the nut with tobacco. The explanation is that ericoline, the principal alkaloid in betel nut, interacts with the mercapto groups and prevents them from neutralizing the cancer-inducing chemicals present in cured tobacco. What are your thoughts on this? And my thought on that is just spiritually bankrupt materialism. That's my thought on that. I never really never heard of any cases. Well, actually once. There was one guy in some village, like a mile and a half from where I lived, who got jaw cancer. Whether it was caused by him chewing betel or not, I have no idea. But that was not the opinion of the villagers, because this guy who got the jaw cancer used to like criticize me because some Burmese people are kind of racist, or they're like Burmese chauvinists. They don't have a high opinion of people from other countries, including Thais and so forth. And he was just saying, if that monk comes to this village, I'm going to escort him right back out again, this kind of thing. And then he got jaw cancer. And of course, the Burmese villagers said, well, you criticize the American monk, and that bad things are going to happen to you. So in his case, it wasn't because he chewed betel. It was because he was bad-mouthing the mysterious Western monk who lived in a cave like a mile and a half away. So, yeah, but with regard to mercapto groups and ericoline and all that, that is like the new modern mythology, as far as I'm concerned. It's just spiritually bankrupt materialism. So anyways, Tig's last question here is, am I an animal? And just going with biology, sure. I mean, just going with empirical observation of the world around us. A dog's got all the same bones in its skeleton that we've got, maybe with a few very minor exceptions, all the internal organs and everything. I mean, we have to eat and drink and shit and breathe and take a pee and all this kind of stuff, just like any other mammal. So just going with that, then sure. Although it is true that human intelligence has somehow shifted us into a different level. It's like we're on a different order of magnitude from the ordinary animal, just because we were capable, to some degree anyway, of like conceptual thought and thinking in symbols, thinking in words. We were capable of culture, like knowledge can accumulate from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, until you've got these upgraded apes that are capable of making computers and helicopters and so forth. So, yeah, just going from a biological point of view, yeah, we're animals. And that's regardless of whether physical matter really exists or not. I mean, just looking at animals and looking at us, we're obviously a kind of animal. And we've got animal instincts too, except they're generally not called animal instincts. They're called human nature, although the left, out of some perverse inspiration, just vehemently denies that there is such a thing as human nature or instincts in the human animal, or at least a lot of leftists do. It's just part of the ideology now. Maybe because Marx was pre-Darwinian and just thought that we're born as a blank slate that are just ready to be indoctrinated with leftist ideology. I think Chairman Mao also believed in the blank slate idea, where you just people can be indoctrinated to believe anything, and to some degree that's true, but it's not true enough for Marxism actually to work. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, and this is from Judge Caligula Bushman. And Judge Caligula Bushman says, Ave Panyobasa, yeah, Salwe, Salwe. Ave Panyobasa, in what order should I read your books? Well, you can read them in any order you like, I suppose. I mean, you could read them in the order that I compiled them, which would be essays in Theravada Buddhism would be first, and then philosophical Dharma was second, I think, and then Buddhist ethics, Buddhist practice is third. But there's no real continuity going on from one book to the next, or even necessarily from one article in the book to the next, from one essay to the next. You could just read it completely at random, and it probably wouldn't have that much different of an effect on you than if you just systematically read them from start to finish, the first book, then the second book, then the third book. So, I mean, read whatever sounds most interesting to you, I guess. That would probably be the most beneficial to you. You might probably get the most out of it. Because the way it is with me is if I'm interested in something, I can absorb it like a sponge. Whereas if something really doesn't appeal to me that much, then, it's just doesn't have much effect. So, as you please, as thou wilt. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Mooners. And Mooners says, how does one deal with severe OCD? I get really antsy whenever I see a glass or a phone near the edge of a countertop or near water. Whenever I see one, I immediately adjust it and put it in a place where it can't fall, regardless of if it is mine or not. And this has given my family frustration. How can I deal with this problem? Well, as it turns out, I used to have a friend who would visit the monastery where I was first ordained in near Santa Cruz, California. And he was one of the world's leading authorities on OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. And one of the most common stereotypical examples of OCD is the person who obsessively washes his hands. He may wash his hands 50 or 100 times a day until it's like the skin is all cracked and bleeding between his fingers, and he just can't stop. Like Howard Hughes is probably one of the most famous people with OCD. John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, may also have had OCD. And Dr. Schwartz, who was the person I'm talking about, one of the world's leading authorities on OCD, he wrote a book called Brain Lock, and you may want to look it up if it's still in print, where he talks about OCD and how to treat it. And the thing with Dr. Schwartz is that most psychiatrists or psychologists, I guess it'd be psychiatrists mainly, who treat OCD use drugs. It's like you use Prozac or something, which reduces the urges. But Dr. Schwartz mainly was using Buddhist mindfulness techniques like Satipatthana, where you have the urge to wash your hands or adjust the cup of water or whatever it is, that you just get into the habit of observing that as a mental state is arising. And if necessary, you then distract yourself by going and doing something different. You don't reinforce it by acting it out. You note it, you observe it. It's not me, it's just OCD. And then if necessary, you go out and shoot some baskets or whatever it is, you take up some knitting or something. And so, I mean, if you really want to study this and learn a good way of dealing with it, I mean, you could do a lot worse than getting the book Brain Lock by Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz and studying that. And at the end, there's even a test you can take to see whether you're clinically significant with regard to obsessive compulsive disorder. I took the test and I I'm not clinically significant. I do have, certain tendencies, like a crooked picture on the wall. Like even the Sasquatch and the UFO back there, it was bugging me earlier. I was having to adjust it a number of times just to get it looking like it's straight. Or if I'd buy a used book at a used bookstore, which is something I used to do a lot, one of the first things I would do would be to unbend the corners if there were any bent corners, that kind of thing. But anyways, yeah, that would be a good idea. Fortunately for anyone interested in Buddhism, that one of the most effective ways of curing OCD is to use Buddhist mindfulness techniques. Just observe it as a phenomenon. You do not identify with it. It's not, I have to wash my hands. It's, this craving is arising, and you just train yourself to observe it. And that would be very useful just in everyday life. Once you get good at observing the OCD, then you can get good at observing just about any mental state that arises and not identifying with that either, not necessarily acting it out. So there was something else I even had a theory after reading, Dr. Schwartz was a friend of mine. I mean, we've kind of gone our separate ways now, but he would send me articles that he would write, and he sent me a copy of Brainlock and everything, which I no longer own. And it struck me that it could be that an enlightened being is like someone who is cured of OCD, where even someone who is cured of OCD, because it's, according to science, it's a glitch in your brain. It's like a genetic, it's genetically conditioned glitch in your brain, having to do with the cingulate gyrus and the caudate nucleus and so forth, where it's like the part of your brain that shifts from one like idea to the next just gets stuck, and so it just sticks in this one idea. So even if you get cured, still the urges are going to arise. They're not going to be nearly as strong because you haven't been reinforcing them by acting them out. But still, the urge will arise, and you just don't identify with it. You don't take it seriously. You don't have to act upon it. And I've considered that an arahant, an enlightened being, may be the same way, where they still have these, deluded human urges and so forth that arise because, again, being human is also genetic, going with scientific materialism anyway. And so, I mean, the human brain is still going to act in accordance with the nature of a human brain, which is delusional. So I do think that an arahant may still have deluded thoughts or deluded unwholesome urges or something. It's just they don't identify with it. It's just nature taking its course. They are detached and they don't act upon it. They just watch it arise and pass away. So yeah, Brainlock by Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz. I would recommend that you read it. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Master Poe, who also ironically goes by the alias of Grasshopper. And Master Poe says, would you please give us 3 nuggets of wisdom from 3 Nirvana beings, such as the Buddha and 2 others you believe made it to the Nirvana place? Well, I mean, I'm not sure if I have beliefs that anyone made it to the Nirvana place, although I do have working hypotheses, and just like, if somebody did, I mean, this person would be a good candidate for that, something like that. I mean, it's not a matter of faith with regard to this person was fully enlightened. It's, I think, more in terms of, assuming that anybody can be fully enlightened within a samsaric context, like the context of this world, then this person would be a good candidate, in my opinion. So anyways, give us 3 nuggets of wisdom from 3 Nirvana beings. Golly. Well, we can start with the Buddha, I suppose. And there's lots of statements from the Buddha, like Chidinaham Bhikkhave Kamam Wudami, which in a way it's very profound, and it had a significant effect on my life. And it means, monks, I say that karma is will. So that's the main statement in the text, not the only statement, but like the most famous one, I assume, where karma is identified as volition or will or urge. And that has really made a significant impact on my understanding of the human predicament in this world. There is one sort of statement of the Buddha that I kind of like, that really is not in conflict with the earliest teachings, although this is from a Mahayana text, where the Buddha, he was going to deliver his sermon as usual, but on that particular day, all he did was he just held up a flower and kind of twirled it between his fingers. And some of the monks were kind of bothered by this, but Mahakassapa, or Kashyapa in Sanskrit, smiled because he got it. That the Buddha, I mean, it's sort of like the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata, where the Buddha is saying, don't believe anything, words are not what you're after, just beliefs are not the point. So instead of giving some discourse that probably some of his disciples would misinterpret or just adhere to, cling to it or whatever, he just twirled the flower and remained silent. And then when Mahakassapa, or Kashyapa, got it and smiled, that was the first transmission of Zen from the Buddha to the first great patriarch, other than the Buddha himself. But that's not really well, I guess it could still count as a nugget of wisdom, even though he didn't say anything. But let's move on to another being that I think may have been a fully enlightened being, and that would be St. John of the Cross. And St. John of the Cross also said a lot of wise things, like, if you're to arrive at a place that you've never been before, you must go by a road that you do not know. Which is wiser than it may sound, because he's referring to essentially the state of enlightenment, or the beatific vision, the state of perfection. That if you want to arrive at this state, you can't go by any familiar route. You can't go by any route that you understand, because it's beyond your understanding. It's beyond the, what's the word I'm trying to come up with, the frontier of what you can really understand. So I consider that to be wise. Another statement by St. John of the Cross is, so that you may know all things, seek to know nothing, which again is fairly well in harmony with the message of the Atthakavagga, which is, believe nothing, have no perception, no view. Because if you want to become omniscient, you're going to have to go beyond words. You're going to have to go beyond just like the inner dialogue, or monologue, I guess. So that's the second potential nirvana being. The third would be Neem Karoli Baba, who is up there on my altar, on top of the bookcase up there. I mean, just a picture of him. He's not really sitting up there or anything, but he used to say, and this is really not good Buddhism, I suppose, but like he would do some mind-blowing psychic feat or perform a so-called miracle, and people would just be blown away by that, and he'd just say Sabishwar Hai, which means it's all God. He didn't do anything. It's just God's doing it. And you can just take Sabishwar Hai, just apply it to anything. It's all God. Of course, if you're not a theist, then you'd have to replace Ishwar, or God, with Tao, or the Dhammakaya, or something. Brahman, although Brahman technically is kind of God still. So I guess that's good enough for Master Poe. I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, how far back does meditation go? Who were the first people to meditate? And I think it's my first book, Essays in Theravada Buddhism. I can't even remember the name of my own book, where there's a chapter on the evolution of meditation, how people discovered meditation. Because it had to start at some point. It wasn't that the human race just appeared on this planet already meditating. That there had to have been like a first person to meditate. And there's different theories that I discuss in the book. That one theory, which it wouldn't be a very deep kind of meditation, is just the human instinct to stare into a campfire. Anyone who's gone camping and spent hours staring into a campfire knows that there's like this instinct. I mean, it pretty much puts you into a mild trance state. And I do think that that's one reason why people stare at TV sets in a mild trance state nowadays. It's just like replacing the instinctive primordial campfire with this flickering light thing that serves the same purpose in a lot of ways. Although there's an interesting theory by Gary Snyder, of all people, who was, one of the founders of the beat movement. He was one of the first beatniks. This was back in the 50s. And he had this idea that I think might be true, that it was prehistoric hunting magic was the origin of meditation, at least of relatively advanced meditation, because Stone Age hunters, lots of them anyway, believed that animals can hear your thoughts. And even my father believed that. He was a hunter. He was a big game hunter in Alaska. And he used to tell me that trying to sneak up on a moose is damn near impossible. It will always get spooked and run away. But if you sneak up on a tree right next to that moose, it's as easy as shooting cows. So Stone Age hunters and some modern hunters believe that animals can hear your thoughts. So if you're like lying in ambush by an animal trail, waiting for your chance to just run out and stab a deer or whatever, then the hunter would sit there with his mind silent, wide awake, not thinking, just so the animal won't hear his thoughts and run away. So that's a possibility too. Or another pretty obvious possibility for meditation would be like prehistoric, like Stone Age shamanic practices. Possibly including the taking of psychoactive drugs that would get you into a kind of meditative state. And then maybe later, some wise shamans might try to cultivate those same states without using the drug. And I've talked about like shamanic practices before. I think maybe in that essay about the origins of meditation, I may have mentioned that my father, when he lived in Alaska, when he was a big game hunter and gold prospector in Alaska, he had a friend named Frank Walunga who was an Eskimo shaman. And Frank Walunga's initiation into becoming a shaman was he had to do like a kind of vision quest, which means he went out into a wilderness with no food, no water, no blanket, anything like that. And he just found a big flat rock and a round, smooth rock. And he would just sat down in front of the flat rock with the big, smooth cobble in his hand and just started rubbing the round, small rock on the big flat rock in a circle, and just kept doing that for hours or even days until something would just pop. The vision would occur. And that's fairly meditative practice. It'd be like some kind of samatha practice. So, I mean, it's impossible to know who were the first people to meditate because almost certainly it occurred way back in the Stone Age. Definitely prehistoric. Like even like the Indus Valley civilization, they've got like seals showing beings sitting cross-legged as though they're in meditation. So yeah, it goes way, way back. And it could be shamanic practices, including maybe taking certain like hypnotic kind of drugs, or it could have been like Stone Age hunters just keeping their mind blank so as not to spook the game. But I do have like the full essay discussing this in one of my books. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rybalder. And Rybalder says, regarding bodhisattva, does this concept exist in Theravada or within the Buddha's suttas? It seems to be a Mahayana or Tibetan innovation. And I mean, bodhisattva is a Sanskrit word, so it's not the word bodhisattva is not going to be found in the Pali texts because the Pali texts are composed in Pali instead of Sanskrit. So the Pali version is bodhisattva. And I do think that bodhisattva is a mistranslation from Pali or Proto-Pali into Sanskrit because it doesn't really make much sense. Bodhisattva literally means enlightenment being, but why a being who is postponing enlightenment indefinitely would be called an enlightenment being, I don't know. But bodhisattva can have more than one meaning. It doesn't necessarily mean enlightenment being. Sata in Pali, I almost said Burmese, can mean a number of things. So it can mean 7, for example, but I don't think bodhisattva means enlightenment 7. But it can also be like an adjective, like an how do I explain this? It's a past participle acting as an adjective. Sata, it's like a past participle of the verb sajadi, which means to be attached to or to be bound for, to be destined for. And that makes more sense. That a bodhisattva is someone who is destined for enlightenment or bound for enlightenment, because that's what it means in the original Pali, where usually when you come across the word bodhisattva in the Pali text, it's referring to Gautama Buddha before his enlightenment. And when he says, before his enlightenment, when he was still a bodhisattva, that means he wasn't enlightened yet. And it got incorporated and glorified in Mahayana through a kind of evolution that as Buddhism became a more popular religion, there was more devotionalism involved, more glorification of the Buddha himself. And so you had a genre of literature called Jataka stories. And the Jataka stories were essentially reworked fables describing the Buddha's previous lives when he is perfecting his paramis, perfecting certain virtues or qualities that have to be perfected before you can become a fully enlightened Buddha. And these Jataka stories implied that to become a Buddha, as opposed to just becoming an ordinary enlightened being, is much more heroic, it's much more difficult, it's a much more stupendous feat. And so you wound up with this glorification of the Buddha, this whole cult or myth of a lineage of Buddhas, and they're just way above, just orders of magnitude beyond an ordinary enlightened being, even though probably originally, in my opinion, they were at the same level as was discussed earlier on in this Q&A. So, yeah, the bodhisattva concept does exist in Theravada, but it's different from the Mahayana concept. The Mahayana concept, they just took the ball and ran with it. Whereas in Theravada, it started off just being the Buddha before his enlightenment was called the bodhisattva, the being who was bound for enlightenment. And then there started being all these legends associated with bodhisattvas. Like, in order to be a real bodhisattva, you have to receive what in Burmese is called a byadate. I can't remember what the Pali word is, but it's like an announcement from a Buddha. Like you're going to become a bodhisattva. So you have to receive an announcement in the presence of a fully enlightened Buddha, some past Buddha, who is going to say, in a future age, you're going to become a Buddha going by the name of so-and-so. And that is your byadate. That kind of locks it in. But this kind of thing, I do not think originated with the Buddha himself. It may be that the Buddha himself referred to himself before his enlightenment as a bodhisattva, but there wasn't, in my opinion, an entire mythos concerning, dozens of Buddhas, throughout, entire world cycles, going back zillions of years. And it's just like this eternal recurrence of fully enlightened Buddhas that go through the same kind of pattern with regard to certain life events that I discussed, I think, in the previous Q&A. So let's see. Yeah, the concept of bodhisattva exists in Theravada, probably for the most part, like the elaborated concept of the elaborated doctrine, as it exists now, was more late than early in the formation of Theravada Buddhist philosophy. And then it continued to evolve after the Mahayana Buddhists adopted it. They didn't necessarily adopt it from Theravada. It probably was common to all of the early schools, or most of them anyway, of Buddhism. And the Mahayana Buddhists really liked that idea for whatever reason. Partly just because the Buddha was considered to be vastly superior to an ordinary enlightened being. So then you got this idea among many Mahayana Buddhists that just taking bodhisattva vows already makes you superior to a fully enlightened being. And there is some support for that in certain Mahayana Buddhist sutras. So, yeah, I mean, the Mahayana concept of bodhisattvas is pretty much of a Mahayana innovation, but they were modifying an earlier, simpler interpretation of bodhisattva, and in my opinion, probably mistranslated it, not really understanding what the word sattva meant. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Mirror of Emptiness, and I have to admit, I do not fully comprehend this question. And Mirror of Emptiness says, is our perception of the universe the continuous perception of Brahman? And so I assume, he didn't say Brahma, so I assume by the continuous perception of Brahman, he's not saying that Brahman is the one who's continuously perceiving, our mental states. So he seems to be meaning that our perception of the universe is really just the way Brahman is perceived. It kind of reminds me of like certain theists who believe in God, think that God creates all these sentient beings in order to, like, so he can learn about what it's like to have a body and so forth. But I mean, if God really is a capital G God, he's already omniscient and doesn't need to learn anything. So is our perception of the universe the continuous perception of Brahman? I don't think Brahman could really be perceived. Brahman exists at a level more fundamental than perception. Perception is like symbolic ideas that are generated by a mind, like a conscious mind. But Brahman is not a symbolic construct. Perception is a symbolic construct, but Brahman is not. That Brahman is more like the porcelain of the cup, and the perception is like the form of the cup, the shape of the cup, or whatever. So, I mean, maybe in certain ways, depending on how you want to interpret it, but I wouldn't interpret it that way. Is our perception of the universe the continuous perception of Brahman? In a way, it's our perception of the universe is sort of like unnecessarily elaborating on Brahman in a way, just sort of taking the uncarved block of marble and it's like separating out an imaginary statue inside that block of marble. But you just get lost in the perception, and so you become oblivious to Brahman itself. Just like, like from a Christian point of view, the Spirit of God is everywhere. God pervades the entire universe, but we just don't notice that because we're all caught up in this worldly, diversity of phenomena, which is generated by our own mind ultimately. Or like Eckhart Tolle says, that we're already enlightened in a sense. It's just that we're too distracted to notice it because of all the noise that our mind is making. And I'm waving my hands around a lot too, as though I'm like part Italian or something. So, yeah, I do not fully understand this question. I'm not sure if Mirror of Emptiness himself fully understands this question, but he probably understands the question better than I do. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from the proto-pseudo-monk, alias Cool Whip. And this is kind of a long question, which contains more than one question. I mean, at least it's counted as one question pretty much. But there's like the number of question marks in this one question is up into double digits. So anyways, proto-pseudo-monk says, the title is On Making Decisions and Living One's Life. Then he says, Master Question Answerer Panyobasa, how must one make decisions in life? And actually, I could probably stop here, but I'll continue. Is the right decision based on reason or emotion? The reality of decision-making seems inescapable every moment we make a decision to be mindful or not, to pursue this desire or not, to cuss and twat a South Carolinian geezer on the highway or not, etc., I am still plagued by unsolved questions many asked, for example, on pursuing worldly knowledge, music, on socializing, friendships with fools, with non-Buddhists, 5 preceptors are rare, finding a wife, career, hobbies, exercise, Dhamma, learning a language, moving to Asia, all the complications of samsaric existence, and the further complications on aspiring towards Nibbana, escaping the sticky web of samsara, how to live one's life. Too many options, too many decisions. Move to Burma, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Japan, retreat into solitude, find a mate, have a family, have a career. And then in parentheses it says this is rhetorical. So all these question marks kind of are neutralized. And then he continues, my current approach, one inspired by Ajahn Jayasaro, although he spoke particularly on taking 8 precepts, is to have faith in the Dhamma, give up as much as I can, simplify my life on the assumption that I am too deluded to make any rational and clear decision, and have faith that one day it will all be crystal clear thanks to practicing the Dhamma. Effectively, I am trusting my decision-making to the wise monk's wise decision, the decision of radical renunciation. One solution is building a venerable Panyobasa AI decision maker trained on the previous YouTube videos that could make all the decisions for me and be a lazy git. Unfortunately, this doesn't exist yet. Please, Venerable Sir, what is your advice on how to make big, small, or any decision in life? Where should we turn to? The Dhammapada, the forest, silence? How do we develop right judgment being enmeshed in all this conditioning? So it all boils down to, which is sometimes the case with the proto-pseudo-monk, that like the very first sentence is pretty much the gist of the question, and then the rest is like commentary. So how must one make decisions in life? Is the right decision based on reason or emotion? Well, as David Hume pointed out, that the passions, I mean, it's what he says, it's like the intellect is and can only be the slave of the passions. That really reason has no motivating force. I think Immanuel Kant also pointed this out, that reason, just intellect, can't cause you to do anything, that it's essentially emotion that causes you to move. I mean, there's no logical reason why you should get up in the morning, why that you should eat instead of just allowing yourself to starve to death. That all of these decisions are based on value judgments, and they're ultimately irrational and largely emotional, or to some degree instinctive, like animal behavior. So how do you make decisions in life? Well, you just do the best you can, obviously. But if it comes to like an important decision, the fact is, like the clearer and more conscious your mind is, the more options you're going to have. And thus the more likely it is that you're going to make a wise choice. So, I mean, at the basic level, like the NPC type of person who doesn't have any original thoughts, they're just sort of motivated by human instinct and just force of habit, then they're just going to keep making the same mistakes and just making the decision that they're programmed to make. And that is not very likely to get you into a better position in life. So, I mean, the more you meditate, the more you practice Dhamma, the more you strive to cultivate wisdom, the more wisdom it is that you're likely to acquire, and thus the more options you're going to have and the more ability to choose the right option you're going to have. So at first, you may have to rely on a certain amount of dogmatic faith, trust in somebody else's judgment that you think is wiser than you, trust the judgments of the authors of ancient scriptures and so forth. But a lot of the time, if you need to make an important decision, one of the best things you can do is just try to get as calm and expansive as you can. Maybe go to a beach, go out into a wilderness where you're not distracted and having all these like artificial rules and so forth that you have to contend with. You just go out into like an inspiring place and just get into a meditative, quiet state, and intuitively, the correct answer is more likely to arise. That's pretty much how wisdom works, is you just make your mind quiet so that, there's like the truth can just percolate up through your consciousness. Whereas if you're just thinking and yammering away inside your head all the time, then it like obscures this and you don't notice. So how must one make decisions in life? Well, with regard to most decisions that you make, what are you going to have for dinner? Which shirt are you going to wear this morning? That kind of a thing. It's largely arbitrary, and it doesn't really even matter all that much. I mean, ultimately, none of the decisions ultimately matter. Because, that's really not the point. What's the commotion going on at the surface really is not the point. The point is, ultimately, there is no point, but like at a level between ultimately there is no point and this, I forgot what I was even saying. But there is like an intermediate stage where decisions matter, I guess. Like, what are you going to do for a living? What girl are you going to marry if you get married, or whether you should get married? Are you going to become a monk or you're not going to become a monk? Then, you really have to introspect if you're capable of that. If you have enough wisdom that you can just introspect and just intuitively have like the best answer just arise in your mind, that would be ideal. But if you can't, then you're going to have to rely on the advice of people that you consider to be wiser than you, and they won't necessarily make the right choice either. Like, some monk may just say you should become a monk because that's the best thing you can do, but not everybody is really ripe for becoming a monk, or just the monk's life is really not compatible with the character, like the constitutional factors of some people. So, you may want to just kind of pray over it in a sense, contemplate. Like, before I found a good forest in Burma, I spent a lot of time. In fact, it was becoming a joke among my friends. I'd just be sitting there, just pondering this map of Burma that showed like the forest areas and everything. And I would just sit there, and I wasn't like calculating. Every once in a while you get an idea and you kind of, run it through your mind and everything, measure the miles and so forth, what ethnic groups live in that area or so forth. But a lot of the time I'd just be sitting there, just kind of just meditating with like a blank mind, just waiting for the right answer to arise. And the right answer eventually did arise. But it could just be just through random chance that the right thing happens. You just happen to meet the right girl by somebody talking you in to going to this party that you didn't want to go to, but just to be polite to your friend, because you owe him a favor or something, you go, and there you go. You meet the woman of your dreams there. That kind of thing can happen. And it depends on your karma. If you've got good karma, you're more likely to have the right thing happen to you, or good things happen to you. Because someone with bad karma, the right thing to happen to them may be bad stuff. But ultimately, we just do the best we can. And I hope I at least knocked a tiny dent into answering that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Indiana Dhamma. And Indiana Dhamma says, if I understand my Dhamma correctly, karma is based on intention. There are 5 offenses that will result in one automatically going to a hell realm: killing one's own parent, wounding a Buddha, etc. But if karma is based on intention, why would even these 5 offenses necessarily result in rebirth in hell realms? One might intend some kind of good, albeit with some warped reasoning, in committing such an action. For example, perhaps a Christian or Muslim zealot might intend to save souls by attacking a Buddha, being ignorant of the truth about Dhamma. Well, there's one story, I think it's in the commentaries, that, it kicks this up a notch, where there was some rich man in essentially prehistoric India, who a Pacheka Buddha was walking for alms. And this rich man, he tells the servants, we got some leftovers, just give him some of those. And so the servants put food into this Pacheka Buddha's bowl. Of course, none of them knows that this is a Pacheka Buddha. How could you know that some ragged monk walking down the street is a Pacheka Buddha? It's not like he's carrying a sign or anything. So anyways, after the servants gave food to this Pacheka Buddha, this rich man who was a bit stingy regretted it and says, well, I could have just gave it to the servants. I mean, it's just kind of a waste giving it to that beggar. So as a result of this person having alms given to a Pacheka Buddha, he goes to heaven for a zillion gajillion years. But because he regretted it afterwards, he also went to hell for a zillion gajillion years. I don't remember which came first, whether he went to hell first or heaven first. But I mean, he didn't even know this was a Pacheka Buddha. I mean, you can't really necessarily know that a person is a holy man or not, or a holy person or not. So, I mean, like the Buddha, it's like somebody might wound the Buddha. I've thought about this. It's like, what happens if like Ananda is shaving the Buddha's head and just nicks him and makes blood flow? I mean, that's literally what it means, is to cause a Buddha to bleed, that you're guaranteed of hell if you cause a Buddha to bleed. And I mean, if you do it accidentally, like you nick him when you're shaving his head, then it would seem that you're not going to go to hell for that. Killing one of your own parents, I assume there are cases where, I mean, like euthanasia, something like that. You sign the papers so that the machine gets unplugged or something. I mean, would that count? Would you be guaranteed of hell in a case like that? Or your father wants to, I mean, he's old and broken down. He wants to commit suicide, and you don't want to kill him yourself, but you provide him with the pistol, something like that. It's out of love for him. He was like this tough macho guy, and he's just all broken down and sick and depressed all the time now because, he's not who he wants to be anymore. So, I mean, I do think that a lot of this stuff in the texts, it doesn't necessarily originate with the Buddha himself, that a lot of it is just, it evolves as a spiritual tradition evolves. Like, I do think that one of the 5 acts is seducing a nun and or raping a nun. And I mean, when there were no nuns, and it's hard to say exactly when the order of nuns arose. I mean, that wouldn't have even been an issue. Causing a schism in the Sangha sometimes is on the list, if I'm not mistaken. Sometimes I get confused, the nun thing and the schism thing. I can't remember which one it is that's on the list. But both of them are considered to be very bad. I mean, originally there wouldn't have been any threat of schism so long as the Buddha was alive, except for the brief sporadic attempt of Devadatta. But maybe I should stop rambling and try to answer this question. If karma is based on intention, why would even these 5 offenses necessarily result in rebirth in hell realms? Well, I'm not convinced that they do. I mean, that's what the book says. But everything you read in a book isn't necessarily true. There are all sorts of things that the Pali texts say that we Westerners just can't believe. Earth being flat, floating on water, eclipses of the sun and moon being caused by a giant asura named Rahu swallowing them into his mouth. Even a lot of the Dhamma-oriented ones that aren't dealing with cosmology and so forth, like the Buddha sitting there just bragging in grandiose terms about how great he is and about how people should worship him. I mean, a devout Asian Buddhist can accept that without raising an eyebrow, but I certainly cannot. Or some master of debate challenging the Buddha to a debate, and then the Buddha says like one casual sentence, and this master debater just surrenders and just quits and just converts to Buddhism. I mean, some of these stories, they just go against human nature. So just because you read something in a text doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. I mean, that's even the Pali texts themselves, like the what is it? The Kalama Sutta. don't believe something just because it's in the Pitaka. Don't believe something out of respect for your teacher. Don't believe something just because it's been a venerable tradition for centuries. Even back then, the Buddha was warning against just having too much faith. So, if karma is based on intention, I do kind of agree with Indiana Dhamma here that it's really not that cut and dried. It's not that simple. There is a famous sutta in the text, I can't even remember which one it is, but it's saying, you give food to a dog or to an animal, you're going to get karmic good good results from that for 100 lifetimes. And then it has this sequential list going up to offering something to the Sangha of the Four Quarters. It's like animal, then you've got like the ordinary person, the scoundrelly kind of person maybe, then you've got like the lax monk, and then you've got like the wise monk, and then you've got the fully enlightened monk, and you've got the Buddha, and even above the Buddha is the Sangha of the Four Quarters, because that includes the Buddha and all the arahants and everybody else. And it's just this cookbook, 100 lives of good results for the animal, then 1,000 lives of good results, then 10,000, then 100,000. Or also there's suttas, saying if you're angry in a previous life, you're going to be ugly in this life. And just, if you have this kind of unwholesome mental state in a previous life, it's going to result in this life. And it's just an oversimplification, kind of a cookbook kind of approach to understanding Kama or understanding Dhamma. So, I've got my own thoughts. Oh, a dog just bumped up against the table. She puked on the rug a little while ago too. Let's see. So I think I'm not even sure if I answered this question. Where's even the question mark? Oh, here it is. But if karma is based on intention, why would even these 5 offenses necessarily result in rebirth in hell realms? I kind of have my doubts. Murdering an arahant, murdering a fully enlightened being, not just accidentally, but like deliberately killing an enlightened being. Yeah, I could see that. Like murdering just with like rage and malice one of your own parents. Like extreme cases. I could understand that they could result in hell. But of course, there are going to be shades of gray and like borderline cases and so forth. And I'm really not so sure about myself. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Skoladin or Skuladin. And he says, would you kindly disclose the long discourses of Carolina traffic? And I've been threatening to vent and bitch about traffic in South Carolina for several episodes now. But I think I'm going to spare you all the long discourse. I'll just pick a few juicy nuggets. I've already pointed out like a few months ago that really, seriously, about half of all the people on the roads around here do not use turn signals. And I pointed out that a friend of mine had said that's because there's a shortage of blinker fluid in this area. But there was somebody saying, well, blinker fluid doesn't really exist. But if blinker fluid doesn't really exist, how are they gonna drill for it? Gotcha there. But also, I've also mentioned before that the red lights in in South Carolina, they last a long time. You're sitting in a red light. There's no traffic at all. You're just sitting there all by yourself at a red light at, some ungodly hour when there's not much traffic. And you just sit there and sit there and sit there at this red light. You're just gathering dust and cobwebs waiting for that light to turn green again. I guess in South Carolina, I can't say nobody's in a hurry because I'll get to that. But still, it's just this laid back, you can just wait forever, it doesn't matter. Kind of. But the thing is, you know how long that light is going to stay red. So when the light turns yellow, as a general rule, you gun it. You try to get through that yellow light before it turns red, and you have to stop because you're going to be sitting there for a long time. So there have been times I'll like go through this yellow light and it looks like it might be turning red when I'm right underneath it. And then just through habit of not living in South Carolina, I'm looking in my rearview mirror to see if, there's any police cars suddenly turning their lights on after I possibly ran a red light. And I look in my rearview mirror, there's like 2 cars following me. One of them's like 12 car lengths back. And they just blow through red lights. It's just a common thing in Greenville, South Carolina, that, if the light turns green, you still have to look both ways to make sure that you don't have some idiot just blowing through the red light. And it happens a lot. And last night, I had some overtime last night. I worked late. I'm driving home, and on I-85, well known from its mention in the Walking Dead series, and the fastest traffic, there's these vehicles doing like 80, 85 miles an hour, and they're all like 18-wheeler semis. They're all zipped up on something, and they're going really fast. It's weird when you like the fastest vehicles on the highway are these semis that are just zipping down the lanes and like changing lanes really fast, like weaving between the cars and stuff. But of course, people that drive slow are even more annoying at times. But I guess that's good enough. I don't want to like monopolize this Q&A by just making half of it me venting about South Carolina traffic. But you'd think that in South Carolina, that it's a Republican state. It's a firmly red state. And so you think that Republicans believe in law and order, but at the same time, there are almost no traffic cops at all. The few traffic cops seem to stop only semis that are maybe doing 85 in a 60 mile an hour speed limit. So it's kind of a weird, like ironic situation where, the cops generally only show up after the accident has occurred. And there's quite a few of those. But again, I don't want to monopolize this Q&A by venting about traffic. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Mary J. And Mary J says, and this is with regard to a video I did with Stevens and Numa last week about like what's the deal with modern Western women. And on the thumbnail made by my sweetheart, there's 2 women. One's kind of traditional looking, just kind of nice looking, but the one on the left has got like spiked hair and like pierced face stuff and like sleeve tattoos on her arms and so forth, who is more stereotypically representative of what modern Western women have become. Anyways, Mary J says, I consulted this with Avenity, who is his biological mate, and I have to say, I would totally, yeah, the one on the left. So that's the kind of the spiky tattooed one about your last thumbnail. So that was just sort of an intro. I probably shouldn't even mention that because it did have the taboo F word that you can see on kids' videos now, I guess, but still. So his first question is there any kind of sex that is blatantly forbidden in the suttas? For example, anal sex. And the monks who composed this stuff really didn't bother with like such intimate details for lay people because you're better off, from the monk's point of view, you're better off just not having sex. So, the kind of forbidden sex, of course, would be like adultery, promiscuous sex with somebody that you don't love or even particularly care all that much about. Having sex with a woman who is under the protection of a man already, like which would include somebody else's slave girl, a woman who's already engaged or betrothed, like a female inmate in a prison who's under the protection or guardianship of the prison guards, that kind of thing. That's the only kind of sex that is specifically forbidden. So getting into the details of like anal or oral or that kind of thing, it's really not mentioned. And the monks who were composing this stuff really were not concerned with what lay people did in their bedroom. That, I mean, they would just say, you're better off just not having sex. Or if you are going to have sex, then have sex with your, one person that you love and you're faithful to, and they're being faithful to you, that kind of a thing. It's not necessarily that you have to be married, but at least you have to be in a loving monogamous relationship, or at least a faithful monogamous relationship. We've got to be realistic. In ancient times, people who didn't love each other would wind up having to get married to each other, but you make the best of it. So yeah, with regard to stuff like anal sex and other things, other kind of fetishes or kinks or whatever, it's not really discussed. It's the only time I remember any mention at all of like anal sex is with regard to the first parajika, for monks, that monks are not allowed to have any kind of sex, not straight, not anal, not oral. And so they just give the borders of, what is not allowable. You transgress this line, you're excommunicated for the rest of your life. And that's really all they care about. There's really no other details other than specifying this line that you must not transgress if you are a monk. And with regard to lay people, of course, then whatever does not transgress the third precept, which is sensual misconduct. And that has no mention at all of anal or oral or anything like that. It's just who you're not allowed to mess around with. So I guess I'm just going to move on to Mary J's next question here. Are there any conspiracy theories you believed in that turned out to be true? Yeah, I think there's lots of them. Just like historically speaking, not mentioning anything in particular, there have been certain elections that had certain dubious qualities, let us say. Also, the origin of a certain virus. Not going to go into details, not going to say that it was like smallpox or anything. And there's quite a few. A lot of them are taboo, because the reason why they were conspiracy theories is because a certain faction of the population just doesn't want you to believe this. It might be true, but they don't want you to believe it. So a lot of the time they'll come up with a conspiracy theory. Like the 51 law enforcement experts who are saying that Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation, or the whole like Russiagate hoax that was concocted by the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic Party. They get to do that kind of stuff just because, they're the elite. They got the money and all that. So yeah, there are conspiracy theories that I have believed that turned out to be true, and I really shouldn't go into details because I really can't think of any just bland, insipid ones. They're all the kind of conspiracy theories that are highly charged politically, that you can get banned from social media for even discussing. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. Also from Mary J. And he says, have you ever drunk that green Red Bull? I believe it is the one that is summer edition, and it is the best in taste. No, I think probably I've seen green Red Bull, but I don't know. I'm just conservative or something, traditionalist. Although my favorite Red Bull is the Asian version, like the version, the original version made in Thailand. And it comes in a little gold can. It's called Krating Dang 250, which is Red Bull 250 because it's 250 milliliters. And I think it would be illegal in the West. At least when I first went to Burma, like in the early 90s, I'm pretty sure that some of the ingredients in the Thai Red Bull would be like illegal in the West. I think they were putting nicotine in it to get people addicted. They were putting in some kind of like steroids, although I guess even vitamin D technically is a steroid, so it's kind of steroids just kind of a scary word because of connotations. They put in something that had to have been similar to amphetamine in certain ways. It was certainly stronger than caffeine. And if you drank more than 4 in one day, you were not going to sleep at night. So I guess I answered that question. It wasn't a very difficult question to answer. And so I move on to the next question, which is the very last question. And it is from Avenity, who is the biological mate of Mary J., who formerly was Pope Kevin, but I guess he got kicked out of that one. So Avenity says, since Buddhism and Jainism are quite similar, what would your best argument be to become a Buddhist and not a Jain? Well, outwardly, they're pretty similar. I mean, they seem to both be based on the same prehistoric, pre-Vedic spiritual tradition of northern India. And so there's certain similarities, like the bald head. Jains are supposed to like pull their hair out instead of shaving it, which probably would be painful. And I don't know if they're still doing that. I've never really met a practicing Jain before. So there is, I mean, the Jains are more into self-torture, or at least traditionally, like in ancient times. Again, modern Jainism may be sort of like modern Christianity, where it's like really lukewarm and easy, and you don't have to do the really radical, difficult, painful stuff anymore. But Jainism traditionally was much more ascetic, much more prone to try to accelerate the burning off of karma, which in Buddhism, according to Buddhism, it doesn't work. If you're trying to accelerate the burning off of your karma, you're just making more karma by trying to accelerate it. And you're just kind of making bad karma by torturing yourself. That is kind of a vicious circle, although the Jains don't believe that. So anyways, one significant difference between Buddhism and Jainism is the whole idea of karma. According to the Jains, if you step on a bug accidentally, you're making bad karma. Whereas the Buddhists say that karma is intention or volition or will. So if you do it just oblivious, you're just walking from point A to point B and happen to step on an ant and don't even notice, then you haven't done anything wrong necessarily. So Jainism has more of almost a materialistic interpretation of karma. Also, they believe in a soul, which would involve belief in a self, which Buddhism does not. And I do think that the Buddhists have a wiser and more, let's just say wiser, a more expanded conscious understanding of the situation in that regard. So, yeah, I mean, superficially, they may look similar, but I do think that Buddhist philosophy is more sophisticated and wiser than Jain philosophy, just based on my understanding of Buddhism and Jainism. I have read Jainist texts, and some of them are pretty far out. I've already mentioned at least once where there's one Jain scripture that says that if a Jain monk wants to cross a river and there's no bridge and there's no regular ferry that goes back and forth, he can only cross that river in a boat if the boat was going to cross anyway. If someone's going to make a special trip just for him to get him across the river, he's not allowed to accept that because it will make karma. And the whole Jain religion is you have to burn off whatever karma you've got, good and bad. You just got to get rid of all your karma because your karma is sticky and it sticks to your soul and weighs it down so that your soul can't float up into heaven. And Buddhism, of course, is a little more sophisticated than that. And I do think that Buddhism is more correct. So, I mean, that's one reason why that would be the best argument to become a Buddhist and not a Jain, is that I think personally, Buddhist philosophy is more correct and more wise than Jain philosophy, regardless of any superficial outward similarities. So I guess I answered that. And so I guess I'm done, because that was the last question. So, you know the drill. If you got any questions about something you think I can answer, like Indian religion, Buddhism especially, monasticism, Burma, me personally, Sasquatches? Feel free to ask in the comments below. And if you liked the video, and I assume you liked it if you got this far, because we are, 2.5 hours in, then click the like button or smash it, whichever you prefer. And subscribe if you haven't already. And be happy.